Thank you so much.
Smita, Latif here, thank you for being able to join and share some of your thoughts on what this regulatory framework. I think this is also a direction that is also being looked upon by the Economic Planning Unit. We are trying to create a much more, agile, flexible kind of framework that would allow business to operate, in a conducive manner. So I call upon your good self, to share with us the paper that you have prepared. And we'll be more than happy to also share some of our thoughts. We may have questions and all that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Andy and MPPS. So it's going to be a short presentation basically outlining some of the key principles that one would require in light of the COVID pandemic, and the role that the private sector, the integral role that the private sector plays here. So just as background, we know that there are 5 basically transmission mechanisms by which COVID-19 is actually, impacting the private sector. You have the lockdown effects, such as like the MCO, where there's a temporary shock to the supplies, and sectors such as retail, hotels have a huge impact. There's also the supply shocks due to decrease in productivity and illness sometimes when it comes to people who fall sick. And then there is a demand shock, which is due to the decrease in the economic demand, both domestically as well as externally, internationally. And for a country like Malaysia, this actually is very important because it's so integrated into global value chains that what happens in some of the main markets heavily impacts what happens here in Malaysia. This is especially true of supply global value chains in the auto or the electronics sector. Then you have the financial shocks, which we are all aware of. And the uncertainty shock, the uncertainty of the pandemic, is there going to be another surge? That kind of decreases the levels of investment, that is foreign and domestic investments, plus innovative activity, which is kind of the driving force of increased productivity for the private sector. Now, the global economic fallout has been severe. It has turned into a global recession, wherein the costs of the pandemic, which started off as a health crisis, has had very severe economic crisis. Now, the chart over here shows us how in an attempt to basically flatten the health curve, there is a huge economic cost to this. Now we are getting into the stage where economies, such as Malaysia, are gradually reopening. We are still going to see in 2020 global FDI to decrease by around 40%. And there will be sharp drops in manufacturing and services activity, especially, for example, the retail and tourism. In travel and tourism, something that we're also going to be discussing in one of the presentations today, in Asia alone, 2/3 of the 75 million jobs are at risk. So this is a sector that is going to be severely affected. Now, having said that, looking at the data that we've seen, how China kind of got out of this crisis, or some of the data that we see from China, we see that one sector that actually increased is e-commerce. So Dr. Latif and Dr. Andy did mention that there's been an increased amount of webinars and digital platforms, but this also extends to the private sector. And those firms that have actually been able to weather the crisis are those that are digitally connected, which makes it very important to actually look at the backbone infrastructure for e-commerce to actually thrive in Malaysia. Now, the economic impacts in Malaysia, as I mentioned, there are the external impacts, FDI, commodities, tourism. One must also bear in mind that this pandemic comes in already with a declining, growth projections that we've seen because of the US-China trade tensions and the decrease in the commodity prices in the last quarter of 2019. Now, the growth projections, the latest growth projections for Malaysia are GDP is expected to contract to minus 0.1%, and I think further decrease. Our most latest simulations will come out in the middle of June. Now, what we see, I wanted to show you. This graph is something I will talk about later on, so in the interest of time, I'm going to just go ahead. Now, in terms of policy action, we divide our policy actions into two phases. One is the containment stage, which is what we saw in Malaysia in March and April, wherein you're looking at containing the health pandemic. The actions need to be rapid, as we saw it happening in Malaysia. They need to be broad-based and inclusive so that you don't really exclude anybody. And most importantly, they need to be transparent and easy to access. And this is important going forward as well, given that social distancing is going to be a new norm for some time. You want to have a less physical interaction, you want to have less physical transactions. So you need to have more and more of these policies actually being implemented digitally so that more people have access. And in the second phase, which is what we're seeing now with the partial lockdown, the economy is gradually returning, but there's still going to be risks, especially for small and medium enterprises that will still risk insolvency. We need to also realize that this recovery is not going to be uniform across sectors. Again, I'd like to highlight that of the tourism sector. Now, something again, just to reiterate, because this is the essence of the presentation, is when you're looking at measures to address the economic fallout of the crisis, you want to be able to take advantage of existing mechanisms. So there are lots of implementing programs already in place. The idea would be to build on those programs to actually tailor it to suit the present crisis. But it also means one needs to leverage on platforms such as Bermuda. The programs need to be very easy to implement so that it is accessible to as many people as possible, be transparent and minimize physical interaction. Be scalable. When we say scalable, in such a way that it can be reduced when the crisis abates, and it can be increased if there was a need, if the crisis were to surge again, or in certain sectors, if we feel that it has had an unprecedented greater effect in certain sectors, it can be scaled up in those sectors. But very importantly, because we're talking about an economy which has fiscal constraints, it needs to be time-bound with clear exit strategies. So the important building blocks for all of this to work, we're increasingly seeing the use of real-time monitoring. So we are using big data to actually get real-time data monitored in many of our countries. This is actually complemented with rapid surveys. Now, rapid surveys is actually something that we do with the private sector. It is similar to what Blossom is doing, but here we do it in high frequency. We sometimes partner with the private sector agency to look at a large sample of private sector and which could be representative nationally. The idea is to look at what is the business sentiment. What are some of the sectors which are harder hit, so that you could actually feed that data into actual agile policy making. When we talk about agile policy making, it's about using this real-time feedback loop more constructively. And here, public-private dialogue becomes very, very important. Similar to what Bermuda has done very effectively in looking at doing business reform, you could look at certain sectors, certain regulatory reforms that are affecting either particular kinds of firms in terms of size or kinds of sectors, and actually use this as a very good platform, as you're doing, to actually inform policy making going forward. Now, just to give you a sense of what you mean by big data, this is data we get from Google Mobility. It looks at real-time data on retail, groceries, parks. This is looking at, they're looking at your GPS coordinates, your phones, and actually tracking this data. And what we can see is that the MCO actually led to a sudden and dramatic decrease in mobility across all the sectors in Malaysia, except you see residential, which is actually improving, which means people actually stay at home. Mobility has picked up gradually since early May, as you will see in the chart on top, coinciding with the conditional MCO, which meant it eased certain restrictions and which came into effect on May 4th. Now, the drop in Malaysia has been one of the most severe in the region. If you look at the second graph on the bottom, in addition to Philippines, it's actually one of the most severely affected in terms of drop in mobility in the region. So what this could do is it provides you, as we continue to monitor it, we will see how some of these, for example, retail and recreation, does it actually increase? As grocery, for example, we would expect groceries to actually increase now as we go into looking at May and June data. And there's also travel-related data, which I haven't shown here, but that actually went right down to zero when we're looking at flights departing versus those scheduled last year. So these are some of the things that we can actually analyze and provide some real-time feedback. But more importantly, when you're looking at monitoring private sector, we have actually developed high-frequency surveys, or we could do it using the Dawson survey. As long as the survey results or the raw data is accessible to policymakers, the idea would be to collect high-frequency data from these firms to understand how this pandemic actually affects their decisions, how it affects their job creation, job destruction, as well as those companies that may be going into bankruptcy and those that could not actually survive. Similarly, we could have, there are questions which actually ask you if the particular policy actions that have been undertaken by the government have actually benefited firms. You could actually also get real-time data on how the policies are really affecting firms. And here again, in addition to this, similar to what Bermuda is already doing, you can have input, get regular input into the regular regulatory reform process. Now, I want to give you just one illustrative example of a reform process and what role public-private partnerships could play. Now, the crisis has had an impact, and it will have a lasting impact on business models and consumer preferences. E-commerce is going to become an emerging trend post-COVID. Now, and e-commerce actually has a very big role to play in actually even preserving some jobs. For example, in terms of restaurants, those that could not have in-room dining, they could actually have delivery service, which meant that they could still have a flow of resources and revenues. Similarly, by having us being able to have groceries delivered online, we are enabling social distancing and enabling people not to go into groceries and have physical contact. Now, what is the role of public policy here? It is, of course, we need to have clear guidelines and SOPs that these various firms need to use. But here is where they will also need to be ensuring a basic infrastructure capabilities and the logistics system, as well as support businesses to adopt digital payments. But in doing so, there are lots of regulatory things that come into play. There is the financial security issue. There are data privacy issues. There's consumer protection issues. There's cyber security. All of these have regulatory and legal ramifications. Now, a nexus such as that NPC has would actually look at these and what are the various binding constraints that do exist that actually prevent fostering greater e-commerce in Malaysia could be something substantive going forward, given that e-commerce is going to be the way businesses are going to be run. In addition, public-private partnerships come in very handy and very critical when you're talking about skills development and entrepreneur development. We have seen that in the PhDs these days in finance. How do you ensure that as many firms and as many SMEs actually become equipped that they can actually adopt these digital technologies and have the required skills to be able to do so effectively? So there again, giving inputs into the curriculum, giving inputs into how higher education as well as technical and vocational training should be tailor-made is very critical and is a key component of the private sector dialogue. Similarly, giving feedback on how the regulatory environment for digital payments or data or the infrastructure logistics, again, very, very important to actually look at these right now. There are huge bottlenecks for logistics or in terms of like trade facilitation. That's something, this is the time to actually work on those reforms. Now is the time like no other, and it's the best time to do so because the need is so dire to actually look at these reforms. So just to conclude, I think I want to reiterate that, while reforms and policy making is at the center stage, the role of the private sector is critical, and the close dialogue with the private sector becomes even more critical in providing the feedback loops that you require so that you can actually course correct, you can actually have the agile regulatory framework that is required of a pandemic that is COVID-19, but also making sure that you're going towards a more resilient and a competitive private sector out of this crisis. So I'll stop here. Is there any questions? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Smita, for your presentation. I would also like to thank you for the report that you have done on the public-private dialogue on business regulation reform, a case study of Pemuda. Very good report that you have put forward by your team. I think this report will be available to us all very soon, right? You have launched this, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much.
We're going to have it online as well as we'll send you the hard copies as well.
Okay.
But I want to also take the opportunity to thank you and Abu Latif and Zahid for your critical inputs into the report.
Also for sharing our case study with the world now. I'm sure 190 over economies will be benefiting from some of the good work we have put through. We look forward to more of such interaction with World Bank anyway through Pemuda and also through Malaysia's good initiative. Now you have pointed out a very good case study and also just now your paper mentioning about this COVID-19, and you're able to share exactly what we are experiencing that there were a lot of good regulatory practice that has been going on, and Pemuda has worked on these improvement initiatives. That's why our ranking also have improved in all the other indicators. Every one of them has had good, improvement initiatives. But during this pandemic period, during this MCO period, and this CMCO period, a lot of the regulatory practices and processes, especially on the front line, they were very much interrupted, as you mentioned it very rightly. So some of these front line, they could have worked online, if they were fast enough, but they missed the opportunity. But some of them have implemented online process. But then we realized that the online process were not a complete process. It was maybe a hybrid process where you go online to submit your application and you go offline to do the hard copy submission, and also then you go offline again to do some payment because some government agency do not have a good e-payment system. So we have seen that during this period, a lot of government agencies were surfacing their deficiency on the online process that they claim they had. And apparently this is a good time to put them all in place plug the gaps and the holes, like what you have mentioned just now. Because another important thing is that when you ask the private sector to go back to business, and some of the industry, especially the essential services, are the ones that have never stopped since MCO. And because they can't operate without the public sector, which is the civil service, all right? So it also makes the whole economy inefficient, especially some of the manufacturing sector. You could ask some industry to come back, but some of them couldn't come back. For example, a good example is that you ask the cooking oil producer to come back and produce the cooking oil, because cooking oil is an essential item, but you do not allow the manufacturer of the bottles, the plastic bottles, to come back, and the packaging people to come back. So what is so good producing the cooking oil where you can't bottle it and you can't deliver it? So this whole essential supply chain needs to be studied. But nevertheless, we are blessed very much that due to our good control and the trust that Dato' Latif mentioned, and the strict implementation and discipline implementation that our Ministry of Human Health have put in. I understand our DG is very strict on this, that we have been able to recover very quickly. And this is the good point. The good point is that we are able to recover very quickly, and we are able now to put our economy in place, except for the last part that we will have also just mentioned, which is the paper, which are some of the papers we are going to present will be on the tourism and the hospitality. Hopefully we get everybody back, and your recommendation and the framework that you have put in are very useful. So I would like very quickly to open up for our members to ask you some questions. Is it okay with you, Smita?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, as you have heard from the papers presented, is there any questions that you would like to pose to Ms. Smita, the senior economist from World Bank? Anything you want to share, Jaya? Mr. Jaya Singham from MITI?
Yeah, thank you, Dato' Andy, and also thank you, Ms. Smita. Of course, they have worked together on many occasions, and I think World Bank have provided valuable insights for the industrial master plan. Just two quick questions. You presented the chart that showed the decline in mobility, but I'm not sure what it really tells. I think obviously when we have the MCO, there will be a drop in mobility, but what is the implication and impact? So that's one. And two, based on the feedback that you've been collecting from the private sector and rapid survey, can you share with us what were some key issues or challenges that they face that, in their opinion, that the government of Malaysia needs to address rapidly? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jaya. Very nice to meet you again. So two quick responses. The chart on mobility was basically to show you how you can use big data. So yes, as expected, you will see that mobility has declined, but also you will see that for groceries and retail, it has slightly picked up early May. So what I was trying to show you was, going forward, if we keep on tracking this, we will be able to see certain trends which could actually inform how sectors are doing. On the second part of the survey, we have not done that in Malaysia. We are doing it in other countries to get, and of course, I'll be more than happy if we've had some discussions with the Ministry of Entrepreneurial Development, but nothing very concrete. But I'm happy if there is interest. We can definitely, we have a survey instrument. We need a proper a platform to be able to have a representative sample. So if there's interest, we can definitely do that in Malaysia. And it would be done every 3 months so that we can actually look at how policy responses